Hey AMS families, Lucas here. Welcome to part 2 of our family Advent videos. These video series that walk us through these big Advent lessons for our families and for ourselves. And so excited for part 2. So week 1, we talked about this idea of holding fast to Jesus. That the Advent season is the beginning of the Christian calendar every year. It points us towards Christmas time, which kicks off the Christian calendar every year with excitement, with hope, with the good news of Jesus, his birth, his death, his resurrection, and his eventual return. And so we walked through this idea last week of holding fast to Jesus. He is our hope. His birth, his death, his resurrection is our hope. So week 2, we're looking at this idea, which is what Advent is all about, living in the hope of Jesus' return. Living in the hope of Jesus' return. And so that's where we're sitting at today as we're talking about our theme, the Advent mission, Jesus' arrival, so that you and I can walk with God and live in the hope of Jesus' return. And so again, for today, I want to just talk to you about this idea that Advent is not only about celebrating the birth of Christ. The birth of Christ is crucial. It is vital. The birth of Christ is the only way. Sending his son is the only way that God could have provided the redemption and the rescue that we needed. So there is great celebration in the birth of Christ. But the Advent season is not only about celebrating the birth of Christ. We celebrate the birth of Christ to prepare us and allow us to look to his return. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. Would you take a brief moment to check out this scripture that I'm about to put on the screen? It's 3 verses, kind of longer. Pause on it for a second and read those. Welcome back. And so just out of this, again, I want to remind you that as we unpack Isaiah 18, as we unpack this idea of living in the hope of Christ's return, that it's important. It's just of the utmost importance for us to remember Jesus' birth this season. It is the reason for the season. It is the reason for Christmas. Jesus' birth is supernatural. Jesus' birth is the only way that God could have rescued and redeemed us back into the relationship with him that we were designed to be in. However, as we remember his birth, we need to allow that to prepare us for his return. His return is good news. And when you think of the second coming of Christ, or when you've seen things maybe from Hollywood, or when you've read things about the end times, maybe it's hard for you to say, is that good news? But the truth is, the return of Christ is good news, because as we see in Isaiah 60, 18 through 20, the return of Christ brings no more violence, no more pain, no more destruction. It brings Jesus and God as our everlasting light, and our everlasting hope is completed in him. And so it is good news. And here's the hard truth, guys. If we can't look to the return of Christ tomorrow as good news, then how can we, as followers of him, return to him today? If we're not looking at his return and his fulfillment of the kingdom as good news, how can we return to him today and depend on him and put our hope in him today if we can't look at that as good news tomorrow? And so we look at Jesus' birth, we celebrate and remember Jesus' birth to prepare us for his return. And so a couple of simple main points. We live in this world that's called intention. There's a tension between death and life, between darkness and light. We're living in the upside down. As followers of Christ, we see the kingdom and we see the teachings of Christ and that he ushered in. But we still also see the effects of sin and brokenness because that kingdom has not been completed yet. And so we live in this world that is called intention. We see this in the scripture. We see the idea that there's still violence, there's still darkness, there's still pain. And so, but there's a promise of the coming kingdom. God says it in this passage. He says, no more will there be violence. No more will you depend on the sun for your light. I will be your everlasting light. I will take away the violence. I will bring the coming kingdom. I will bring the completion of the coming kingdom. But it is Jesus who does these things. The coming kingdom, that work began at earnest with his birth. That is why it's so important to celebrate his birth in his season, because the coming kingdom was ushered in, redemption was ushered in, and that began in earnest at Jesus' birth. Furthermore, he was made triumphant in his resurrection. The resurrection was the defeating of death. The resurrection was the conquering of death and sin and pain once and for all. The resurrection was the victory over that. And so it was made triumphant in his resurrection, and it will be made complete once and for all at his return. It will be made complete at his return. That's why we look to his return with the greatest of hope this Advent season. And so in the face of the tension that we see, in the face of the upside down that we live in, the Advent mission is open to us to walk with God today in the confident hope of Jesus' return. His return is our good news. His return is our hope. His birth is amazing news. His death and resurrection is the greatest of news. But we also, in this Advent season, walk with the hope of Jesus' return and the completion of God's plan and God's redemption. His return is our good news and is our hope. So our action item for today coming out of this truth is that we live out this hope. We live out the hope of the Advent season by seeing the glory of God all around us and by seeing the image of God in the people that we meet. And we act, no matter what actions we are doing today, and I'm talking about the simplest of action, whether it's doing schoolwork or playing sports or texting someone or playing video games, or if adults, if it's your work or your meals or your family time, whatever it is, we act in all ways as part that the kingdom that is here, we act out of that kingdom that is here and still coming with Jesus. We look to see the glory of God all around us, and we look to see the image of God in all the people that we meet. We live in the hope of his return. So I got a couple of discussion questions for you. I'm going to put those on the screen now. They're all meant to drive you and your family towards this thought that we live in the hope of his return this Advent season as we live into the Advent mission. Check out those discussion questions. Take as much time as you need. Welcome back. I hope you had just amazing discussion in around those questions. And so lastly, I want to leave you with a prayer prompt. And this prayer prompt is an exercise I'd love for you to do right now, but one that you can do at any given time as well. It's called a glory sighting. And so essentially what a glory sighting is a story or just kind of a mental note of how you've seen the real and active God acting in the world. And so that can be something this week. It can be something in the past months. It can be anything. But I'd love for each person to take a moment to note and call out a glory sighting. And then as you pray, offer your collective praises to God for all of your glory sightings. Thank you for tuning in week 2 of the Advent series. We live this week in the hope of Jesus' return. That's what Advent's all about. It's an honor to be on the Advent mission with all of you. I'll see you soon.